There was a time when the idea of living together felt like the answer to everything. No more goodbyes at the end of the night. No more counting down the days until you could see each other again. No more distance between you and the person you wanted most. Just finally, the same home, the same mornings, the same ordinary, beautiful, everyday life. Together. And then you moved in. And something happened that nobody warned you about. Not a fight, not a betrayal, not even a moment you could point to and say, that's when things changed. Just a slow, creeping, disorienting realization that the closeness you expected, the closeness you had dreamed about, was somehow not what you found on the other side of that moving truck. Instead, you found something strange, something counterintuitive, something that felt like a kind of loneliness you had never experienced before. A loneliness that existed, impossibly, inside the constant presence of the person you love. You share a bathroom now. You share a kitchen. You share a bed every single night. And yet, on some evenings, you sit across from each other in the same room and feel a distance between you that somehow felt smaller when miles literally separated you. How is that possible? What happens to two people who love each other, when they finally close the distance between them and discover that proximity is not the same as connection? Stay with me, because the psychology of what happens when couples move in together is one of the most important and most misunderstood stories in modern relationships. There is an assumption built into the architecture of modern romantic love that almost nobody questions. It goes like this. Closeness is proximity. That the path to feeling connected to your partner is the path towards sharing more space with them. That the logical endpoint of love, its fullest expression, its deepest realization, is the shared home, the shared bed, the shared daily life. This assumption is so widespread, so culturally embedded, so intuitively obvious that most couples never think to examine it until they move in together and discover that it is, at least in part, wrong. Not entirely wrong. Living together can be profoundly beautiful. But the assumption that physical proximity automatically produces emotional closeness, that sharing a home is the same as deepening a connection, that assumption leads millions of couples every year into a confusion they don't have the language to describe. Because what many couples discover in the months after moving in together is something that feels almost paradoxical. The more space they share, the less connected they feel. The more constant the presence of their partner, the less they seem to actually reach each other. The closer they are in the physical sense, the further they sometimes feel in every other sense that matters. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively. They have a name for it. They have mapped its mechanisms. They understand with remarkable precision why it happens and what it requires to reverse it. And today, on The Connection Theory, we are going inside it completely. I'm Dr. Alex Morgan, and this is the psychology of why living together can make two people feel further apart. Let me start with the psychological concept that explains this phenomenon at its root. It is called the familiarity paradox, and it operates on a principle that is counterintuitive but neurologically precise. The more familiar something becomes, the less attention the brain allocates to it. In the early stages of a relationship, when two people are not yet living together, every interaction is elevated. Every evening together is an occasion. Every conversation carries a slight electricity of novelty. Every morning waking up next to this person feels remarkable because it is not yet ordinary. The brain, encountering something novel and emotionally significant, responds with full attentional resources. Dopamine floods the reward circuits. The prefrontal cortex leans in. The nervous system is alert, engaged, interested. But the brain is also extraordinarily efficient. And one of its primary efficiency strategies is habituation, the automatic reduction of attentional and neurological resources allocated to experiences that become predictable, familiar, expected. When two people move in together, they transform each other from an occasional, special, attentionally elevated experience into a constant, background, taken for granted presence. And the brain, doing exactly what it is designed to do, begins to allocate its attention accordingly. Your partner becomes, in the neurological sense, furniture. This sounds harsh, and I want to be clear, it is not a reflection of the love. The love can remain entirely intact. The brain can continue to classify this person as deeply important, deeply valued, deeply cherished. But the attentional resources that create the felt experience of connection, the resources that produce the feeling of being truly present with another person, of genuinely seeing them, of being genuinely seen, those resources are no longer being consistently directed toward the person who is always there. Because the brain, quite logically, reserves its best attention for what is new, for what is uncertain, for what requires active processing rather than passive background registration. And the partner who is always there, in the kitchen every morning, in the living room every evening, in the bed every night, gradually stops registering as something that requires active attention. They are just there, known, assumed, present. And paradoxically, that constant, unvarying presence is precisely what makes them, over time, feel further away. Here is a neurological truth that most couples never encounter, but that explains so much of the confusion that cohabitation creates. The human visual system has a phenomenon called perceptual fading. When a stimulus remains completely still and unchanged in the visual field, when it neither moves nor varies, the neurons that process it literally stop firing. The image doesn't disappear from the retina, but it disappears from conscious experience. The brain, efficiently allocating its processing resources, essentially stops seeing what never changes. This is not a metaphor for what happens in relationships. It is a precise analogy, and in many ways, a model for what the broader nervous system does with emotional and social stimuli that become constant and unchanging. Neuroscientist David Eagleman at Stanford, in his research on perception and change blindness, describes the brain as fundamentally a change detector rather than a reality detector. We do not perceive the world as it is. We perceive the world as it changes. And what does not change, what remains constant, stable, predictably present, gradually recedes from conscious perception. Apply this to the experience of cohabitation. Before moving in together, your partner was someone who changed in your perception, who appeared and disappeared, who was present and then absent, who was anticipated and then arrived and then missed. That variation, that rhythm of presence and absence kept the brain's change detection systems active, kept your partner registering as something worth paying full attention to. After moving in together, the variation disappears. Your partner is simply always there, and the brain, faithfully executing its design, begins to register them less. You stop noticing the specific way they look when they are thinking. You stop hearing the particular quality of their laugh. You stop registering the small emotional cues, the micro expressions, the body language, the subtle shifts in tone that once told you so precisely what was happening inside the person you love. Not because you stopped caring, because the brain stopped actively processing what it no longer experiences as new. And the terrible irony is this: the less the brain actively processes your partner, the less connected you feel to them, even as they sit 3 feet away from you on the same couch. There is a third layer to this psychology, and it goes deeper than neuroscience. Attachment theory, the framework developed by John Bowlby and expanded by decades of subsequent research, tells us that human beings are wired for a specific emotional rhythm in their closest relationships. A rhythm of proximity and distance, of closeness and separation, of reaching for the attachment figure and being reached in return, of going out into the world and returning to the safe harbor of the person who matters most. This rhythm, this alternation between connection and autonomy, between togetherness and separateness, is not a design flaw in human attachment. It is the design. The pendulum swing between closeness and independence is what keeps the attachment bond alive. What keeps desire and curiosity and genuine interest in the other person continuously renewed. When two people live apart, even in a serious committed relationship, this rhythm operates naturally. There are evenings together and evenings apart. There is the experience of missing someone and then being with them again. There is the re-encounter, the reunion, the fresh perception of someone you love after a period of absence. That freshness is not trivial. It is neurologically and psychologically significant. It is what keeps the relationship from settling into the kind of background familiarity that gradually erodes felt connection. But when two people move in together, the pendulum stops, the rhythm disappears. The reunion, with its dopamine, its freshness, its renewed attention, never happens. Because there is no separation to reunite from, and both partners, without understanding why, begin to feel a kind of flatness in the relationship, a loss of the electricity that used to characterize their time together, a sense that something is different, not wrong exactly, but different from what the relationship felt like before. What is different is the rhythm. What is missing is the pendulum. What the relationship now requires, and what most cohabiting couples never think to consciously create, is intentional separateness, deliberate autonomy, the regular, structured experience of being apart from each other, so that coming back together can remain neurologically and emotionally an event worth the brain's full attention. Now, let's get specific about the patterns that accelerate the distance that cohabitation can create. Because the familiarity paradox and the loss of rhythm are powerful forces, but they are made significantly worse by specific, identifiable, changeable behaviors that most cohabiting couples engage in without realizing it. The first mistake is what psychologists call merged identity, the gradual, unconscious collapse of two individual identities into a single shared unit. When couples move in together, especially early in a relationship, they often begin doing everything together. The same social events, the same leisure activities, the same daily routines, the same friends, the same everything. This merging feels like closeness. It feels like integration, like the relationship is becoming more unified and therefore more secure. But it is actually doing something psychologically damaging. It is eliminating the individual, the separate, autonomous, independently interesting person that each partner originally fell in love with. Because desire, attraction, and genuine curiosity in a relationship are not directed toward a merged unit. They are directed toward a person, a specific, particular, independently interesting person who exists in their own right, who has their own inner world, their own experiences, their own perspective that is genuinely separate from yours. When that separateness disappears, when there is no longer a distinct other person to be curious about, because their life has become entirely continuous with yours, the curiosity goes with it. And when curiosity goes, connection follows. The second mistake is the elimination of occasions. Before cohabitation, couple time was always special because it was not the default. Every evening together was by definition a choice. But after moving in, the default becomes togetherness. And when togetherness is the default, when it requires no effort, no planning, no intention, it stops being experienced as an occasion. It becomes background, routine, the unremarkable texture of daily life rather than something worth being fully present for. The third mistake is treating shared space as shared experience. Couples who live together often spend enormous amounts of time in the same room while having entirely separate experiences. One is watching something on a laptop, the other is scrolling through a phone. Both are physically present, neither is actually with the other. This parallel occupation of shared space creates a particularly insidious form of distance because it looks like togetherness from the outside, but it produces none of the felt connection that togetherness is supposed to provide. Both partners end the evening having been technically together and having not connected at all. The fourth mistake is outsourcing emotional processing. Before cohabitation, many partners process their emotional lives through each other, calling to share news, texting to process a difficult experience, reaching out when something happened that they needed to talk through. The relationship was the primary container for emotional experience. But when you live with someone, the urgency of that outreach disappears. The difficult thing that happened can wait until you get home. And when you get home, it somehow doesn't feel worth mentioning anymore. The moment has passed. You're tired. They seem busy. And slowly, the relationship stops being the place where emotional life is processed and becomes instead the place where everyone comes already processed, already managed, already resolved. Which means the vulnerability that once characterized the connection, the rawness, the need, the reaching for another person in the middle of experience rather than after it, that vulnerability goes underground. And connection without vulnerability is connection without depth. The fifth mistake is the assumption that proximity is maintenance. Cohabiting couples frequently believe that because they are always together, the relationship is being tended to, that presence is the same as investment, that sharing a home means the relationship doesn't require the same intentional effort it did before they moved in. This assumption is not only incorrect, it is one of the most reliably damaging beliefs in long-term cohabiting relationships. Because the opposite is actually true. Cohabitation requires more deliberate relationship investment than long-distance dating, not less. Because the forces that naturally generated connection, the novelty, the reunion, the deliberate occasion making, the freshness of absence, have been removed. And something conscious and intentional must be put in their place. We need to talk about something that makes the cohabitation paradox more acute in the modern era than at any previous point in history. The way Americans cohabit today is structurally different from previous generations, and those structural differences have specific psychological consequences for the relationships inside them. The most significant change is what might be called the retreat into private digital worlds. Previous generations of cohabiting couples, for all their problems, shared a domestic environment that was largely free of the kind of individualized, personalized, infinitely stimulating private content consumption that defines modern home life. They watched the same television, they read from the same newspaper, they occupied the shared space in ways that, while not always deeply connecting, at least pointed their attention in the same direction. Modern cohabiting couples share a physical space, but each occupies an entirely separate digital world. Different streaming queues, different social media feeds, different podcasts in different earbuds, different apps, different communities, different parasocial relationships with different online worlds. The result is a form of cohabitation that is, in terms of shared inner experience, closer to living alone than to the shared domestic life of previous generations. Two people in the same apartment, each fully immersed in a separate universe of content and connection that has nothing to do with the other person. This matters enormously for the psychology of felt connection. Because felt connection, the kind that keeps a relationship alive, requires shared experience, shared attention. The ability to say, we were both present for that, we both saw that, we both felt that together. When all experience is individualized, when there is no longer a shared attentional field in the domestic environment, the opportunities for the spontaneous, natural, unplanned moments of felt connection that used to characterize shared domestic life become increasingly rare. And the couple who shares a home but inhabits entirely separate experiential worlds finds, eventually, that they have less and less to say to each other. Not because they have grown incompatible, but because they have stopped having experiences in common that give them something to be present about together. There is also the specific pressure of modern performance culture on the domestic environment. The curated life that both partners present online, the carefully filtered version of their home, their relationship, their daily existence, creates an implicit standard against which the messy, complicated, unglamorous reality of actual cohabitation is constantly being measured. The couple that looks perfect together on Instagram comes home to the same dishes argument, the same exhaustion, the same comfortable silences that have gradually stopped being comfortable. And the gap between the performed relationship and the lived one creates a specific kind of shame, a reluctance to acknowledge that living together is harder than they thought it would be. Because acknowledging that feels like admitting that the relationship is not what they claimed it was. I want to say something now that I believe is the most important insight in this entire episode, and one that I hope you will take with you long after you finish listening. Proximity is not intimacy. Closeness in space is not closeness in connection, and the assumption that living together automatically deepens a relationship, that the sharing of daily life produces the sharing of inner life, is one of the most quietly dangerous misconceptions in modern romantic culture. The deepest intimacy between two people is not created by eliminating the distance between them. It is created by choosing to cross whatever distance exists, physical or emotional, with full presence and genuine intention. The couple that lives apart and carves out intentional, fully present, genuinely attentive time together will almost always maintain a deeper felt connection than the couple that lives together and floats past each other in the background noise of a shared routine. Because what creates connection is not proximity. What creates connection is attention, is curiosity, is the experience of being fully seen by another person who has chosen in this moment to give you their complete and undivided presence. And here is what is both challenging and hopeful about this understanding. It means that the distance many cohabiting couples feel is not a verdict on the relationship. It is not evidence that they chose wrong or that something is fundamentally broken. It is evidence that proximity was allowed to substitute for intentionality, that the relationship was allowed to run on the autopilot of shared space rather than the engine of shared attention. And that is not a permanent state. That is a pattern, and patterns can be changed. The path back to felt connection for cohabiting couples is not found in dramatic gestures or expensive solutions. It is found in the deliberate, consistent, unglamorous practice of choosing to be fully present with the person who is always there. To look up from the screen and actually see them. To ask a question you don't already know the answer to. To be curious about who they are today. Not who they were when you moved in, not the version of them you have memorized and filed away, but who they are right now, in this moment, in the ongoing, perpetually interesting project of becoming themselves. To create, inside the shared space of a shared life, the experience of genuine encounter, of two people meeting each other, freshly, attentively, with the full force of their interest and care, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. That is what closeness actually is. Not the sharing of space, the sharing of presence. And it is available right now, tonight, to every couple who has the awareness to reach for it. Here is what I want you to carry out of this episode. If you moved in with your partner and found that something you expected, some particular quality of closeness, some electricity, some feeling of being truly together, was not quite what you imagined on the other side of that transition, you were not wrong to expect it, and you did not fail to find it. You simply encountered one of the most consistent and most under-discussed realities of cohabitation. That living together removes the forces that naturally generated connection and requires something new, something intentional, something chosen to replace them. The research on this is clear and consistent. The couples who maintain deep felt connection through years and decades of shared domestic life are not the couples who had fewer challenges, or more natural compatibility, or some special quality of love that protected them from the familiarity paradox. They are the couples who understood, or gradually discovered, that proximity is not the destination. It is just the starting point. That the real work of connection, the daily, ordinary, endlessly renewable work of truly seeing and being seen by another person, does not end when you move in together. It begins. Start tonight. Not with a grand conversation or a romantic plan or a structured attempt at reconnection. Just with presence. Just with the simple, radical, quietly revolutionary act of looking up from whatever has your attention and actually seeing the person who shares your home. Not the background presence you have learned to navigate around. The person. The full, particular, constantly changing, endlessly interesting human being who chose you and who is still, right now, worth every bit of your most careful, most present, most genuinely curious attention. They are right there. See them. I'm Dr. Alex Morgan. This has been The Connection Theory. If this episode opened something up for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more psychology of love, intimacy, and human connection, and I'll see you in the next one.